Well,
How
I'd like to be more. So,
yeah,
so
yeah,
good morning, everybody. We're going to get started with our webinar and preparing for emergencies. We're like the Ohio State. We have the "the" in the title, emergency preparedness. It's going to hear about the what, the how, and the why of it. Uh, our lead speaker today is going to be Phil Spiezio. He's the Senior Safety Officer in Washington County, and he's the president of the Empire State Safety Association. And going to walk you a little bit through these things. Before we get started too much, remember to open up your Q&A pod. That's where you can put your questions in, and we'll be monitoring those. Jody and Amanda in the background will be doing that. And open up your chat pod, because we put a link to the Town of Red Hook Disaster Emergency Preparedness Plan. Everybody should have one, and we've got one we got from Red Hook that we thank Teresa Burke for letting us share. And we'll talk about a little bit about making sure that stays updated and preparing for emergencies that you might not expect, like the one we're about to hit for the next couple of days between the rain and the floods and the heat. So, Phil, take it away.
Thanks, David. Thanks very much. Yep. And as David mentioned, I work for Washington County as a senior safety officer. Also, a little plug for the Empire State Safety Association. If you haven't heard of us, take a look, Google us, jump on the website, take a look at us, see if you might want to be a member and join if you haven't already. So today we're talking a little bit about emergency preparedness and what that means and how can we prepare for things that's unexpected. We'll jump in a little bit, talk a little bit about the internal incidences and how we handle that. And then we'll look at the community side of things, the external things on what public works and our teams might get called to help assist with. So a couple of things right off the bat, 3 points that I'd like you to consider to think a little bit about as we're working through this morning is prevention first and then protection. So you'll see this a lot throughout the slides, but it's much better to be on the prevention side of things than have to kick in the protection measures. The second thing is communication. How do we communicate, especially from the community standpoint? How are you able to talk to fire, EMS, public health, sheriffs? What's that interoperability that you have set up within your program? And do you test that? How do you communicate? Because that's one of the big factors with the ability of allowing everybody to go home whole every day is that communication. That's a key point with it. And then consider the low frequency, high risk events. So typically when we're talking about emergency preparedness, those are the type of events that we're going to encounter. It's the low frequency. We don't do it very often. That means the memory bank is pretty lean. And it also comes with some high risk. Those are some things you want to just think a little bit about. That's where the red flags, the sirens, things of that nature need to be going off. It's like, okay, what are we going to do to control hazards here? So let's talk a little bit about what we're preparing for. So an incident, right? Unplanned event that adversely affects work operations, right? Now, if it's a safety incident, it caused or could have caused injury, illness, or property damage. So that's what we're talking a little bit about today, is an incident in which the unplanned event adversely affects work operations in some way, and it could have caused or did cause an injury, illness, or property damage. So you can see here a picture here. This is an obvious incident of an entrance cable wire coming into the meter box on a building. So internal incident, couple of agencies involved. Luckily that it was caught early on in the relative grand scheme of things. Minor incident, nobody was hurt. There was some property damage, but that's how that ended. And then we talk a little bit about, and this is more the topic today, some serious incidences. All right, what's the difference, right? You're typically, what's the difference between an incident of an emergency and then, getting towards the definition of disaster? And it's outside resources, right? Some sort of collaborative event, community effect, right? That sort of thing, typically of longer duration and multi-agency. And that's where, okay, where do our public works teams fit in to something in which we have an issue, and it's a fairly large scale incident? So to pause a bit, and we talked about this, I think, the last time that we were on, back in January is there's three things. I break things down in three things quite often, you know, safety program, task, hazards, and control measures, right? You take care of what you do, you take care of the hazards associated with it, you control them. Those three things, task, hazards, and control measures, that's your whole safety program, right? You want to build a culture, you talk about trust and leadership and communication, right? That sort of thing. If you want to do leadership type stuff, you say it, you do it, and then you document what you did, right? People are going to follow if you do that sort of thing. Say what you're going to do it, and then document what you did. So when we look at the systems, the training and the culture, it's like everything breaks down to this. So when you look at your preparedness programs, when you're building them, it's like that's the system. All right, and the system won't be worth the paper it's written on unless we train, unless we communicate people on what those systems are, right? And there's a number of different ways to do that. But without that training, without that communication specific to your system, you have to question whether it's worth the paper it's written on. Yeah, a compliance person may come in and look at your program and say, oh, this is great, right? But people have to understand it. They have to understand how to work with it, their roles and responsibilities within that system. It's also an engineering. Systems are, what are we putting in place to control the hazards? The training is, okay, making sure people understand how to use those systems. And then the culture part of it, really important here is what is our culture like? How is your culture like? Do people look at the systems, buy into them? Do they do the training? Do they participate? And that culture is a huge part of that too, is how are we going to work together to give us that synergy within the program so that everybody has the opportunity to go home whole. So when we're talking about this today, think about your systems, think about how you train people for those systems, and then think about your culture and how it is. And I know from watching over the years, I'm dating myself a bit, but I've been out of college, I guess, since 87, 88, been in the fire service since 81. And I look at things and see how things are so different now compared to what they were before. And with technology and people having information at their fingertips, you have to grab somebody's attention a lot quicker now than what you used to do. You used to be able to back into it a little bit. With that, the people coming into the workforce have different skill sets now than what they did. Especially I see it with the public works, I see it with the fire departments, see it with, you know, building grounds, things like that. People are coming in with a background that wasn't quite the same background as 20 years ago. So we have to consider that. If you build systems, you really have a good place to start your employee orientation and how it is that people are doing their job, what you're asking them to do. So it's a good idea to think a little bit about the systems, the training, and the culture as we go through this. So hazard control, just a little bit of a review before we jump into this too much. Right, a hierarchy of hazard control, it's really important to be up there where the green is, right? Eliminate or substitute. Do you have to do it? Is there some sort of something else that will allow us to inspect that bridge or inspect that trench or culvert instead of sending somebody in, like, you know, thinking about a drone for a bridge inspection, right? Can you get close enough, get pictures that you can actually go ahead and figure out what might be wrong with that structure without having to send somebody up on scaffolds and work off some sort of a lift of some sort. So that's an example. Elimination or substitution is, do we really have to do what it is we're thinking we should do at this point? Is there a better way? Engineering controls, right? That's isolating somebody from the hazard. That's your guard on your PTO shaft, the screen on your box fans. This day, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of box fans out there, right? It's much better to tell somebody, hey, make sure the grid or the guard is on that to protect the rotating fins, as opposed to telling somebody, hey, don't put your finger in there when the fins are rotating, because you know what, if it's Phil's going to be putting his finger in there. So practices and procedures are our next level. That's, one of the things that we have to develop when we've done everything else and we have to do that task. Um, make sure that we have good procedures, good policies, and that people understand them, and that the people actually doing the work are built in or are part of the process of building those practices and procedures and things like that. Training, we talked about that. We have to train people specific to the practices, procedures, systems that we have in place. And then last but not least, PPE, we'll talk about that today. But picture of a little bit of a hazard here. If that's not taken care of, that can turn into a pretty big emergency. That's a gas line at one of our pumps. So that was caught and repaired before it ended up being a real emergency. To simplify a little bit more, and I mentioned earlier, breaking things down into 3 pieces, right? It gives it some definition. You can simplify it and go elimination, you can go prevention, and you can go protection. And the area that we're probably looking more at today is that elimination prevention side of things. When we jump into protection, that's when the higher risk in things. So let's look at that and apply that as we go through here. But what is the acceptable risk, right? There's risk in everything we do. We have to be sure that we're getting that risk, that amount of risk we're taking down to an acceptable level, right? So that's what we're trying to do today. We can't eliminate all risk, right? There's risk in getting out of bed in the morning, I talk a lot about, right? Hopefully, most days it's worth the risk of getting out of bed in the morning, right? So that risk versus reward. And we start getting into emergency preparedness, that's something we really have to consider is what is the reward for the risk we're about to take? A vacant building on fire, right? A vacant building, we know it's confirmed there's no one in there. The only time that we're adding a risk of life safety there is when we go in, when our responders are going into that building. So you have to weigh that. What's the reward versus that risk? There's no life safety at this point in time until we decide go, no go type thing. So that's what we're looking a little bit about. That's an example. This is just a picture of a hard helmet from years ago that I had, and asked me to overlook a simple safety violation would be asking me to ask me to compromise my entire attitude, toward the value of your life. And that's one of the things when you think about, you're helping each other, right? Yeah, certainly I've been known to take some risks. Just the other day, I've been doing some work on the front porch, and I had one screw that I missed that I wanted to take out, right? And not step ladder wasn't handy. I grabbed the screwdriver, tried to reach up, could just barely not reach the screwdriver, right? So I had to make the decision: do I step on the railing and then therefore reach, right? Or take a minute, go in the house, grab the step ladder, and you get the step ladder to take out that screw, right? It's human nature is, I can stand up there and get away with it, right? But can we get away with it, right? The other day I was finishing up a workout in the track. It was hot. It looked like there was an all-star game starting up at the high school. And I noticed this woman walking across, and I didn't notice what she was wearing on her feet, right off the bat. But then as she's walking to me, I could tell she's on her cell phone, and it had rained that morning earlier. And she had on just, some open-toed sandals type thing, probably not the best traction in the world. So as she's walking to me, she's on her cell phone, and she slips and just almost goes right onto her back. But, she slipped, caught herself and fell, and, she screamed, and she's on the phone, and she just explained to somebody on the phone, what had just happened. Right. And then I called just enough the conversation to find out that the person she was talking to was actually on the way to the game. So you make those decisions, right? That risk of walking and talking on the cell phone and footwear and not being able to watch where you're going, right? You're doing some things at the same time there. You really have to consider, and everybody's got to help each other, because we all get caught in that position where it's like, okay, the need for being productive or using that time as wisely as we can. We got to think a little bit about that. because we can get carried away. All right, so internal incidents first, make sure we have a good program to handle them, right? An internal incident can be an injury, it can be an illness, right? Some sort of fire, possibly internal, right? Electrical, chemical, property damage, and also the near miss. We can't forget the near misses, right? These type of things are what we want to try to prevent from an internal standpoint. So this is where we develop our systems, provide the training, and ensure a culture that allows people to check on each other to make sure that, hey, we're minimizing the risk to an acceptable level, right? And what we're doing here is looking at this stuff and saying, okay, what can we do so that something similar doesn't happen in the future? And that's where that near miss comes in. But there should be some sort of a program that you talk about, that you have on paper, from an emergency preparedness standpoint for internal events, right? So obviously, if you need an outside response of some sort, you need EMS, you need fire, you need police, you need some sort of assistance, you're calling 911, right? And your program should dictate something to that effect. If it's a serious injury, certainly if there's smoke or fire, things like that, a gas leak, or even an odor of gas, you have to start wondering, okay, what is this? And that's sort of a 911 call, right? If you don't know what it is, get help on the way. It's always better to deal with a false alarm than it is to have something delayed from a response standpoint. Down power lines, you're involved in power lines, that's a 911 call. Some sort of electric smell or even a hot smell, or suspicious people, things like that. So that's a few of what comes to mind, right? Report them to your supervisor, make sure you fill out the appropriate paperwork, and then help people, whoever's doing the investigation, with your safety team or the management team or whatever, help them so that you can possibly keep this from happening again, something similar happening again. So that's a little bit about the internal stuff. So switching gears, talking a little bit about, all right, some of the events, some of the emergencies that we may have in the public sector, in the community side of things, that certainly our public works teams and other agencies of the community would be involved in. And it's kind of like analyzing risks. We talked about that a couple of minutes ago, but what are the risks, right? What are the rewards? And then taking these incidents and say, okay, what is more likely that we're going to be involved in here, right? Bring up wildfires comes to mind, right? Natural disaster of a sort, right? Our area in the soil makeup, the composition and things like that. Yeah, we can have wildfires, there's no doubt, in the springtime, and maybe even a period of time in the fall. But we're not having wildfires like California, that sort of thing. So it's somewhat region specific when we start looking at this, but we have to look at the risk involved, right? If we have that situation, but we also have to look at, okay, how likely is this to happen? And we have to make sure that we spend our time preparing on the events that we're more likely to have. And you can look back in history and kind of see that, right? Around here, you were thinking about flooding and stuff. David and I were talking just briefly before we got started, right? We're dealing with some hot weather now, right? Can the public works teams help with the hot weather? Absolutely, both internally and externally, by knowing where the cooling shelters is and things like that for the community, what we can do to help people, checking on people, things like that. But also today, if you're out, flagging, directing traffic, working in a trench, bridge job, tying rebar, things of that nature, vibrating. If you're out there for 10 hours today, you've got to build in some sort of a rehab, recharging type system where you've got shade, you've got water, things like that to minimize that hazard a little bit. So we're talking about both man-made and natural emergencies and what our role in these emergencies would be. So let's look at a possible type of events that we might be involved in. So from a community standpoint, we're looking at, large fires, maybe an involved vehicle crash with, mass casualties, things like that, where we need to help out with road situations. not too long ago, we had a bus incident in our county, and there was kids on the bus and things like, thank God everybody was okay. But there was some public works teams working in the area, and they came right to the scene and were going to be able to help if need be with that sort of stuff. So you would be involved in many things. You know, the likelihood of a plane crash hopefully is relatively minor, but that's an example of something that you may end up having some resources requested from the public works. Large scale searches, a possibility, you know, et cetera. So you get the idea of the community emergencies. Large fires, in wintertime, you might be called for sand or salt or loaders or things like that. On occasion, you might get involved in the building collapse type stuff and cleaning things up and making sure the road's safe like that. Natural, right? We're running into some hot weather now, and then it sounds like there's a possibility of some floods, some high winds, things of that nature. This is one of the more likely events that we have in our area, is this type of thing where the weather is changing. And we can have anything from, you know, trees down to involving power lines to large scale power outages and things of that nature. That we have to be prepared for. The technological events, you know, hazard materials, right? We have the ERG books at the end. As long as we have some time, I'll go over that quickly at the end of today, but everybody should be familiar with those guidebooks, right? Some dam failures, some large scale power outages, and so on. So, and then the terrorism that we continue to talk about continues to be in the news and things like that. And that's something we have to be prepared for both internally and externally, right? Those of us that have water systems and things like that, and computer systems that operate the water and sewer systems and things of that nature, right? We have to be sure that we're protecting ourselves from, you know, the cyber attacks, bioterrorism with the water supplies and chemical emergencies and things like that. You know, and also the active shooters and the workplace violence stuff, right? Again, both internally and externally. More and more, we're having conflicts with a snowplow operator or somebody cleaning off the side of a road, drainage, things of that nature, shoulder work. You know, so we have to be prepared. And the plan has to be, you know, covering these sort of things. We have to train people to the systems, to the program that we have written, like the example that we have in the chat box today. So when you think about it, the public works team is critical when it comes to many of the emergencies that we might have that's community-based or are out there. And then let's break down the phases of the emergency management for a preparedness type thing. And there's 5 typical phases, right, for being preparedness, making sure that you're ready for it, that in all of these phases, the public works teams could be involved in. Prevention, right? That's one, right? Thinking about the potential of floods tonight, tomorrow, that sort of thing, and the weather coming in, right? Do we have the proper size of culverts out there? Do we have the drainage system set up that, you know, will help when it comes to, you know, the possibility of flash flooding, things like that? Have we took a look at the trees in our villages, our towns, our counties, especially the dead trees or the dead limbs in the trees? Have we had a plan to take that hazard away to prevent the possibility of a tree falling? Not too long ago, it was a couple of months ago, we had a tree come down on an area of the road that I do a lot of running on, and it came down and it took 2 entrances off 2 different residents. The power to those residents is taken off, right? You know, if we were able to take that tree down ahead of time, wouldn't have caused, you know, that emergency per se. But you know, everybody was okay, some property damage and things like that. But that's that prevention side of things. Public works were involved in all the time, from shoulder work to culvert work to bridge work, to tree work, things of that nature. Protection, we're certainly involved in the protection phase, and then certainly mitigation, response, and recovery. So those are the 5 typical phases that we should be talking about for our program with the preparedness. And you know, we not only have help from the local government, but the state government and federal government through the Stafford Act and things like that. there's a mutual aid agreements and things, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. So I'm getting ahead, but there are systems and interoperability where we can actually make a difference and synergize, where everybody still has their certain areas of expertise, area of command, but we can work together to allow everybody the opportunity to go home whole. So this picture in the background, a fire in the business district, involved fire, and this is an actual picture of, before our apparatus arrived on the scene. So, fairly significant community event emergency in this case. And we did bring public works teams in, not only a loader, but a plow truck with salt and sand, because as you can imagine, it looks pretty cold. And we made a lot of ice through trying to minimize that incident, if you would. So, all right, so where do we start? Starts with us, readiness both at home, within our public works teams, and also helping out with the community, right? Again, we got an eye on prevention, but we're talking about preparedness and protection, right? But we want to do what we can to prevent these happenings if we can at all possible. So our individuals, families, households, things like that, right? We to be prepared for our home safety, right? You maybe consider a backup generator, certainly first aid kits and food and supplies and things like that, not only for yourselves, but maybe your neighbors. Don't forget your pets, right? And check on the people that may have some medical needs, some functional needs in your area, right? Have a plan set in place to help that sort of things. I know my wife, she has a whole grocery store, I swear, in the basement of things that she keeps stocked up on. Volunteering for emergency organizations, right? There's different organizations within the community that you might be able to volunteer with to help out, not only from a protection standpoint, but from a preparedness standpoint type thing. Some sort of, completion from emergency response training courses and things like that. And also monitoring communications, right? Have a way in which, where you talked earlier about communication, how important it is. Be sure that you have a way so that, the public safety teams and the people out there trying to communicate an update, that you have a way, email or text message or phone or email of some sort. All of them, the media type, the digital media type stages, have a plan so that you can monitor communications. I know our public safety team with Glenn Gosnell and Tim Hardy, they're always out there communicating, and we have the luxury of having a great public safety team that actually works with all of our agencies and communication. They're really good at communicating things. So Jody, I happen to see a hand raised by somebody. Do you see that? Anything to jump in on, or I'll keep going, but if that's
Nope, I'm not seeing any questions or anything,
okay.
so I think you're okay.
Okay, perfect. And it might be somebody just hit it by mistake. Thanks, Jody. Jody's in the background helping in case there's anything put out there in the Q&A or questions or things like that. So, all right, so now that was the individual. That's what we do at home. Now, what can we help out with from a public works team ourselves, right? So the public works team preparedness plan, right? And we've got one shared there today in the Q&A or the chat. Check that out. And also, if you ever need anything, we're talking about a couple different programs. One's the overall preparedness plan, and then another one is, if you're called to a hazard materials incident. We'll talk about that a little later, but there's a 1910.120, I think it's paragraph Q, specifically that, that's something that if an auditor, PESH came in, they'd be interested in seeing that. And that's something you want to put in place if you don't have one too. But anyway, the overall preparedness plan, right? Stay informed and communicate, right? How do we communicate with our other agencies, public health, social services, if need be, right? Sheriffs, police, fire that we talked about earlier, right? Our public safety teams. Do you have a frequency on your radios? Portables, right? Important too. It's funny, I went to school for electrical engineering and I carry a portable around. I have to ask our public safety team all the time, well, how do you use this portable? And they just say, don't worry about it. Just listen, don't talk. But it's something to think about is how do you communicate within your different agencies and organizations, right? Because you at a scene and you can't figure out how to talk to somebody, it's difficult, right? We have our incident command and typically an area command, but oftentimes you need to be able to communicate through the radio as well. Training, again, the training has to be specific to your plan, right? If the training isn't specific to the plan, then we're just kidding ourselves if the plan is worth anything, right? Facilities, right? DPW, we have facilities, right? We typically have backup generators and pumps and you know, things of that nature that the community would need, right? Certainly equipment and supplies, right? You talk about the loaders and the dump trucks and PPE, right? That's the last measure, but personal protection becomes really important when we talk about minimizing risk for the unexpected type things. You know, one of the things I ponder here is that, you know, greatness is dictated by how you prepare when no one is watching and how you perform when everybody is watching. And people may not know, and you don't have a plan possibly, or you know what, we haven't revised it, we should be looking at that. Right? It's everything's okay until it's not okay. So that whole preparedness is always behind the scene. But, you know, when things go really well, it's not necessarily just because of the event, it's because of that preparedness. So greatness is dictated by how you prepare when no one is watching and how you perform when everyone is watching. And that's something to consider when you're talking about teams, right? And when you are talking about teams, don't forget that trust, that leadership component, that communication component. That's the basis, that's the foundation of that whole readiness, preparedness type thing. And I know I've talked about that in the past, but you know, one of the things is working in safety and health for so many years, both in construction, heavy construction prior in the private sector to now public sector with all of the different agencies and things like that. I get a feel for that work environment 10, 15, 20 minutes into working with a, you know, a public works team or a public health team, you know, corrections, some of those departments, you can get a feel for how the culture is and how the leadership is, you know, what level of trust there is, you know, 15, 20 minutes in, and the departments that have trust, that have a component of leadership and do well from a communication standpoint, all of the other things come into line much easier than if there's not. All right, so we talked about the home, we talked about the public works team. Now we're getting into the community a little bit, right? This is where everybody's heard of the incident command system, or the ICS, and it's encompassing an area of command and also the emergency operations center, or commonly referred to as the EOC. Again, a plug for our public safety team, because they're always ready in putting that into place, and they have different levels of activation for the EOC, and everybody knows their roles and responsibilities, because, you know, the likelihood of us knowing too far in advance that we need to put this system into place, we just don't have that. So it's a good framework to be ready, because you never know when you need to put it into effect. It's always when you least expect it. Unity of effort through unified command. This is very important, is we all come at an emergency from different angles and different aspects and things like that. And we have to provide synergy to make that work, so that our efforts are given the ability and given everybody the ability to go home whole every day. Because all of this stuff, right? Some of what we do within the different departments or agencies that respond are what they normally do, but oftentimes it's not. When it comes to a large scale community event, our memory banks may be a little bit lean, so we all have to help each other through what we bring to the table as far as our knowledge and experience and things like that. If you haven't ever looked at it, there's 14 core capabilities. We don't have time today to take a look at all of them, but I will say, through that national risk assessment and the 14 core capabilities, planning, operational coordination, public information and warning, they compass all of those phases, all of those five phases. If you remember, those phases were the prevention, the protection, the mitigation, the response, and recovery. And that planning, operational coordination, public information, and warning span all of those. So that's something to build into your plan and take a look at and say, okay, how do we communicate interagency wise when we're called to those community type emergencies, right? So an incident occurs, what's our priority, right? Saving lives, right? Protecting the property and the environment, preserving both or all the social, economic, and the political structure. So those are the priorities when a large scale emergency disaster, if you would, occurs in our community. Those are the incident management priorities, right? Oftentimes I talk a lot about the saving life portion, right? When we have an emergency, if life isn't endangered and we're rushing in, we're putting our lives in danger now. So we're getting called to an incident that wasn't necessarily involving a high level of life safety. And now because we're responding in, now we have a high level of life safety, right? So we have to be careful about that. We talk about that within the fire departments and the EMS and public safety arena, is that, remember, when we rush in, right, if there wasn't lives at stake before, we're adding that life safety component. So you really have to think about it. All right, what's the reward? What's the risk? What's the acceptable risk? And it's a balance of these things. But I thought would be nice to at least talk about our priorities. And so be careful. So, it could be as simple as we get called in to clean up a tree down the middle of the roadway, right? Well, the first thing we need to do from a safe distance, is check to see if power lines are involved, right? Because it was just a tree, the tree's down in the power lines, and there's nobody involved. From a people standpoint at this point in time. When we go there, now we're involving people, right? So now we make sure that there's no power lines involved. If there is, then we get the power company to come in and turn the power off, and then we're taking care of a tree, right? That sort of thing. So that's what we have to be a little careful of, because when there is an emergency, right, sometimes we have tunnel vision, we're rushing in, we're trying to do whatever it is to mitigate that situation. But in doing so, we may be adding more risk than what the reward is. It doesn't match up. So think a little bit about that. Saving lives, right? Right. If there's some life safety involved, right? From a public works standpoint, we're still there most likely to assist with the responders in some way, maybe shutting down roads or hauling in, material, something like that, depending on flooding or a hazmat incident. But we don't want to create an emergency ourselves or life safety ourselves that wasn't already there when we responded in. So what type of duties, if we're called to an emergency, what type of duties do we expect to be called to do, right? They're often non-routine work, right? Yeah, it might be routine work from a chainsaw standpoint sometimes. It might be routine work from a loader filling a dump truck and bringing material to a hazardous material incident, right? But for the most part, it wasn't a planned work. So that brings some hazards into it in itself. So the first thing is a briefing on the specific hazards involved. And it's especially important for, hazmat incidences, or maybe a chemical type thing, that sort of thing. Review your hazard control measures, right? If there is a hazard, it's like, okay, what are we doing to control the measure? What are we doing to make that so it's an acceptable risk? And then lots of times when we're talking about emergency situations, it's the last level of protection. It's still an important measure, but it's the last measure, and that's that PPE, personal protective equipment. Oftentimes, you may be wearing PPE that you don't normally wear that much, and that brings into some hazards into itself, right? Daylight today, if you're putting on more equipment, it's going to be hotter. It's much hotter to wear chaps today than it is at 30 degrees in the wintertime, things like that. So with that comes control measures of cycling people through, having a bit of a rehab in a staging area and things like that. So don't forget the initial briefing. That's a critical. Talk about the expected tactics. With the tactics, what are the hazards? And then what are we doing to control those hazards, right? That should be understood both at the management leadership level, but also with the people doing the work. So that's important when it comes to a larger scale incident. You're going to meet up with the incident commander or a person of that area of command, and you're going to work together with these tactics to be sure that everybody has the opportunity to go home whole. All right, so requests for incidences, types of incidents, emergency response. Some of the obvious ones: trees down, flooding roadway or infrastructure washed out, a request for equipment and or personnel. unsafe road conditions, a building collapse of some sort, hazardous material incidences. These are some things that you could expect to be called to. Also, it comes to mind, mass casualty events. There's a possibility of having a request or two for something such as that, right? And with those requests come the hazards. So readiness and preparedness is probably the biggest thing here, right? Is if we are expected to have storms this afternoon, are the saws sharpened, right? Are they full of fuel? Do we have some mixed gas ahead of time stored, right? Is all of our equipment fuel is it 3/4 or more? A good rule of thumb with your preparedness plan, if you talk about the fuel levels in your equipment, machinery and things like that, 3/4 or more, typically keep it to that level. If it's less than 3/4, think about fueling it up, that sort of thing. Dump trucks and snowplows, right? We could get called to an emergency where, public health needs to get in, or a rescue squad needs to get in, and we've got a 3-foot snowstorm, right? The wind's blowing and things like that, right? DPW folks, public works teams, we've done it, have been able to get in and get access to a driveway to get the EMS rig in. There's both smaller scale type emergencies and larger scale emergencies. So we have to account for both. Flagging work zones, road closures, right? That's a hazard in itself. I know that I've set up a road closure not too long ago with the fire department, and the road was closed for quite some time. It was actually the call that was involving the entrance wires to 2 different residences, and I had a person come up to me and she said, "I got to get through here. You don't understand. I got to get through there." I said, "No, ma'am, it's not safe to go through." And we had the road closure signs up and fire truck there and all of that stuff, right? And I have to get through here. And there was a detour set up, and she could follow the detour, right? And she says something to me. This was like 6:30 at night, so I didn't get my run in. I didn't get dinner, right? That sort of thing. I was supposed to meet my wife actually for a burger that night, and had to call and say, "Hey, we just got called out." And she goes to me, "Don't you have anything better to do anyway?" So I just think that's funny, is that you have to expect that from people. They're impatient, they're in a hurry, things of that nature. So that whole flagging work zone stuff, I can't stress enough that, give yourself an out and make sure that you look at every vehicle like as if it wants to run your what over. So, and then non-routine work, right? When it comes to an emergency situation, we are working with stuff that we don't normally do that often, right? There's some of the work we would do, not all of the work. So we have to have our head on a swivel, make sure we understand the hazards. That briefing is very important. So take the time to meet, to understand what the tactics are, to be sure you got good hazard control measures in place and they're communicated. That's a really important when it comes to being prepared for emergency activities, is understanding that process. Don't just rush in, talk to people that are there, that sort of thing. So activities, what are some of the activities that could cause, potential hazards? Right. So we obviously energize power lines, right? If we don't know if they're energized or not, we have to assume that they are energized, right? How do you work around something such as this? If you're involved in an incident and power lines are, on your vehicle, right? We had one a couple weeks ago, maybe even last week, right? A truck, struck a power pole and power lines were on it. What do you do, right? Do you stay in the vehicle? Do you get out of the vehicle, right? That sort of thing. And, if there's a reason to get out, it's on fire or that sort of thing, right? How do you get out and get out safely, right? Do you hop? Do you shuffle your feet? Things of that nature, right? So have a plan for something if you're involved in internally or on a larger scale externally. Right, severe weather conditions. There's a possibility of that later on today, and it sounds like maybe the next couple of days. Right, wind, heavy rain, snow, lightning, temperature extremes. Right, we've got that. We go from warming shelters in the wintertime to cooling shelters and things like that in the summertime. But take a look at the stuff out there and say, okay, it's hot today. It's 90 degrees, whatever, heat index of maybe, towards 100. I don't know. But those are things in which you've got to watch out for each other. build some shade if you don't have it, right? And make sure you stay hydrated, things of that nature. Possibility of flooding, right? Flooding comes with the potential of contaminated with sewage and chemicals and things like that. Open manhole covers. You get a flash flood and a manhole cover gets opened and you start walking through the water, you're not going to be able to see if that manhole cover is in place or not. So, you know, that flooding we talk about, don't drive through floodwaters. Don't be walking through floodwaters either, right? Remember, if there's no life safety involved, when we get there and we're trying to mitigate something, we are putting life safety in, whether there is life safety or not. So measure that risk. Falling limbs and flying debris, right? That's really a danger, right? We had somebody not too long ago, a dead limb in a tree fell down and fell out of the tree and hit him in the head, you know, that sort of thing. So watch out for things like that. Hazardous materials, we'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. And then slip, trips, and falls. I'd be remiss to not say that our activities, whether we're getting on and off equipment, whether we're walking, whether we're climbing, whatever it may be, slip, trips, and falls are always a concern. And each year they're one of the number one reason for somebody to get injured. So do what you can to minimize the slip, trips, and falls. Incident scenes can be chaotic. Keep them organized. Keep them typically on one side of the road. Try not to do staging areas on both sides of the room, whether it's road, whether it's equipment or supplies or things of that nature. So, all right, so we listed the hazards. Now, just bringing us back to the hazard control measures. And I thought the picture here you'll see is a picture beforehand when he's on the 5-gallon bucket, which if any of you know me, that's a big pet peeve of mine is I don't like people standing on 5-gallon buckets. It's just the risk that's not worth it. That's not an acceptable risk, right? And then a short time later, he's actually got the step ladder out. So why I put this picture in is that these are the systems. And when you stay in the green, which means eliminate or substitute, right? Or in engineering control, where you separate out the hazard, that's where you want to work, wherever you possibly can. Now, from a preparedness standpoint and responding to emergencies and working on emergencies, the engineering, the elimination starts to become a bit more difficult, but there are tools out there. There are things out there, systems out there that can minimize the risk and can kind of keep us out of, if you would, the hot zone or the danger area per se, right? But when we get to the safe work practices, right? This gentleman, I know if we sat down and we said, hey, we've got this work to do, let's write a work procedure, right? Let's write a system, right? Of, all right, what tool are we going to use to do this job with? We would have put in writing, it wouldn't have been a 5-gallon bucket, right? It wouldn't have been a bucket. It wouldn't have been a chair, right? It wouldn't have been a bar stool. It would have been a ladder, right? So we know that ahead of time. So we have to work together to get everybody to say, you know what, it's not an acceptable risk. Let me take the time, go get the ladder. It takes 30 more seconds, 45 more seconds, that sort of thing. So when we start to get below the green, below the engineering control level, that's when it relies on us, right? We have to do the training, and then we have to use the right PPE. We have to be trained to use the PPE, and we have to be able to use it, to care for it, to maintain it, and properly wear it. So don't forget, when we go to emergencies, we're adding a life safety component into it just by us responding in, being called to assist with it. So talk a little bit about the DOT Emergency Response Guidebook. This comes out every 4 years. Everybody should be familiar with this. There's an app for that, just like there is for many things these days. There's an app that you can go on, and the app, trust me, I'm not the most technical knowledgeable guy with a cell phone and things like that, but it's extremely easy to use, and it remembers the chemicals and keeps a diary, if you would, a dialogue of what you've looked at, a glossary of what you've looked at. So it comes out every 4 years. So the new one just came out In fact, I think we have some copies. We just got to get them out and circulated. But one of these books should be in each one of your public works pieces of equipment, your loader, your dump trucks and plow trucks, your foreman trucks or your superintendent trucks, things of that nature. Everybody should have one of these guidebooks. Why? Because you're on the road, and the likelihood of you coming across an accident or a crash and have some sort of chemicals in that crash is fairly high, fairly significant. So you should have an idea of how to use this book before you come across in the event, or there's a possibility because of the equipment, because of the materials you have, you may be called in to a hazardous materials event. So it's something that's out there. You can Google it to find the app for it, and you can also get the book. Oftentimes the books come through your public safety team, and they help get it distributed out. So the 2024 are out with the current updates. This is an important page. It's right underneath on the cover, the front page, the page number 1 essentially here with this. And this tells you everything. This flow chart tells you how to use the book, right? If you know the UN number, the ID number, right? In chronological order in the yellow, you'll see search for the ID number in the yellow pages, right? That gets you to the guide number. The orange pages, it's what tells you what to do, right? The green pages are you know, isolation distances and things like that. And if not to get too far ahead, but there's different types of polymerization type chemicals that you'll want to go to the green first. If there's not a fire, if there's a fire, you're always going to the orange first. But for the purpose of our public works teams, whatever you can do to get to the orange is going to give you the information you need as far as how far back to stay, how far to keep people back and things like that. So from an awareness level, if you come across this is what you want to do, is keep yourself safe and keep people around you safe, right? The blue number, if you happen to know the name of the material in the blue pages, you'll find them in alphabetical order, and that'll give you the guide number in the orange book or in the orange pages. And that'll tell you exactly what you're working with. So that flow chart, take a look at it. We don't have time today to go through the whole thing, but you can actually see if you see a rail car, if you see a road trailer, the size and shape of those things can actually help you get to the guide number by using this book too. So you don't always have to see the placarding to be able to figure out what something is. And obviously there's multiple chemicals that go to one guide book, good guide page. So an overview of the ERG. The white pages are giving you general information. The yellow pages are giving you the information once you get to the orange pages of the ID number. So if you have the ID number, go to your yellow pages. If you know the product name, you're going to the blue pages. Those two will help get you to the orange pages, which is the emergency action guides. And then the green pages are for your isolation distances and things like that. So that's kind of a quick overview, but everybody should be familiar with that ERG book and how to use it, type thing. So how does this affect us, public safety team? We're not responding to hazmat incidents. Typically, we may be the first ones there, and then by default, helping to secure the scene to a certain degree, but on occasion, you may be called to this. So when it comes to an awareness level training for emergency responders, public safety teams, things like that, there is something in the OSHA manual. It's 1910.120, which requires a written plan so that if you were called to a hazmat incident, which, you know, likelihood of being called to something to help contain it is relatively high. You need to understand, okay, what is my role and responsibilities, right? So it's always a good idea to approach any sort of a chemical from upwind, if you need to approach it at all. Your job may be just to keep people out, right? Secure the scene. Identify the hazard from a safe distance. It's always a good idea to have a pair of binoculars with you in your truck. to be able to take a look at this sort of thing. There's a rule of thumb. It's actually a rule of thumb where you put your thumb out, and if you can see the incident around your thumb, you're too close, back up type thing. But assess the situation as safely as you possibly can and communicate that, right? Call 911, call your public safety team and say, hey, I've got a spill. I do know what I think it is, or I don't know what it is, right? Report where it is. Don't forget, when you're calling in, your location's critical, right? And then what's going on is second. But you know, think about the cross intersections, the streets and things like that to help the 911 team get out and get some people out there quickly to help you. But continue safely to observe the emergency until other responders get there, right? Keep the scene secure the best that you can. Stay upwind. You know, don't know the dangers, then don't go near the chemical spill. You never want to walk in something, touch something, inhale something, taste something, right? That's not a good way to figure out what type of chemical that you're working with, right? So stay away, secure the area. And then if you are requested to go, this whole briefing of what exactly they want you to do and how to protect yourself is really critical, and that's spelled out in that 1910.120. So if you haven't, reach out. We certainly help you find that and put a little plan in effect as in either an appendix or an addendum to your overall preparedness plan if you'd like. So be very careful about the chemical type things. So the why of it, right? I shared this picture, I think, a couple of times ago, but you know, this is what we want to avoid. This is an internal incident. Everybody was safe with this. He was able to get out, called on the radio to dispatch. The 911 team sent resources, and everybody was okay. But in the bottom line, what we want to do is be sure that everyone has the opportunity to go home whole every day, right? When we put our shoes on in the morning, we expect to take those shoes off at nighttime, things of that nature. I've been called to different companies and different agencies and helped with fatalities over the years. Probably the best thing from a safety standpoint, from a safety person that's helping to develop cultures, is creating the event in someone's mind without it occurring. Because if you create the event in someone's mind without it occurring, they're sharp, they're thinking about it, things like that. That's probably the best thing that you can do is describe that event without that event happening, to keep everybody sharp and on their toes and things like that. So this is what we want to try to prevent. This is an unplanned event that adversely affect work operations for sure, from an internal scale standpoint. So prevention first, then protection, right? That was one of the key points we wanted to get across in the beginning, right? Is that prevention is much better than protection. Think about our low frequency, high risk events and be sure that we're doing everything we can to minimize that risk to an acceptable level. Understand the risk versus the reward. And making sure that when we go in to help, that we don't create life safety issues ourselves, right? You know, the longer I do this and the more I think about things and say, all right, how can I affect change? How can I affect a culture that safety is the number one value, right? You know, that's what we try to get at. And, you know, there's different things, the inspections and write-ups and holding people accountable and things like that. I can't help but to think the most productive way, the most effective, efficient way is developing relationships, because relationships matter. And I know personally myself, what drives me more these days as I approach 60 years old and really taking a look at, you know, not only back, but, you know, going forward a little bit is how to make a difference, how to make a positive difference, make tomorrow better than today in some way. Those relationships are probably the thing that drives me the most out of anything. Don't forget, every incident is a number, and every number is a life, and every life is a story, right? Family, friends, coworkers, community, whatever it is, right? When something happens and a serious incident or fatality happens, we all suffer a loss from that. And what we need to do is work together to give everybody the opportunity to go home whole, to work on their prevention things, but be ready with our preparedness and our readiness. If protection has to kick in, that we not only can protect our community, but we can protect our own people. And that's probably what I would like you to get out of today. If the biggest thing is, don't forget your communication. Prevention is much better than protection. And think about the low frequency, high risk events. The memory bank is pretty lean, and the amount of risk that we need to take in something like that is pretty large. So we want to get that, minimize that risk to an acceptable level. So with that, think we bring the program to a close. Jody or David or Amanda, is there any questions out there? Anything in the chat we need to talk about?
Don't see anything, Phil.
Great.
Folks still might want to open up your chat pod because we put a link to the emergency procedures document and again, remember the Red Hook emergency preparedness plan. So best time to look at those plans is before the emergency happens.
Absolutely.
With that, everybody have yourself a great day. We'll be getting certificates out to you in a couple of days, and everybody be safe in the heat and in the rain. So hopefully it's all less than they said.
Correct. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Phil.
Yeah.